Hey guys, Midnight Monster here. Today we take a look at unsolved mysteries that have absolutely no plausible explanation. Let's get right into it with story 1. I was at a friend's house in high school. He was gone to some family event and I was there alone chilling till he got back. While he was gone, I heard footsteps in the other room, things falling over, doors opening and closing. I freaked the fuck out and locked myself in one room. The footsteps came up right outside the door off the room I was in and just stopped. The room I was in had 2 windows, opposite sides of the room, curtains on each side. A few minutes after the footsteps stopped outside my door, there was a very loud bang on both windows at the same time, and the curtains on both windows, opposite sides of the room, remember, flew straight out. I'm talking almost a perfect 90-degree angle from the wall, as straight as a sheet of paper. I called my friend thinking he was fucking with me. He wasn't. I could hear his family in the background. I've gone through every possibility I can think of. I thought maybe an intruder, but no, his house is too small. I would have heard forced entry from anywhere in the house. The footsteps would not make sense. They would stop in one place and then be heard again in a completely different part of the house. Nothing explains the curtain thing. They had no central AC, so no air movement to account for that blowback. And nothing can account for those simultaneous bangs on both windows. He told me over and over he believes his house is haunted. I've never believed in ghosts, but I questioned my belief that night. When I was about 20, I had a bunch of dreams featuring a man. He had a long, very straight black hair, very tan, really bright blue eyes, and eyebrows like Michael Keaton. He always had this calmly threatening demeanor, even when he was furious, and he had an air of evil to him. He was the main antagonist in any nightmare I had for about a year. Anyway, one night, I had a dream that I was walking down the street. It was a bright day, but all the light was almost dark, if that makes any sense, which is also a common theme in my nightmares. A woman was walking about a half block in front of me with really curly hair. She was crossing a side street when the man appeared around the corner and started following her. I freaked out, knowing he was a threat to her, and tried to yell a warning. Nothing came other than a squeak. I tried to run and help her, but could barely move. The man slowly looked back at me and very calmly said, "This one's mine." He caught up to her, and I watched helplessly as he decapitated her before waking up. I usually talked about my nightmares with a friend, but this one I kept to myself. About a week later, I was hanging out with a group of my friends. There was a girl there with really curly hair that I've never met. Eventually, someone started talking about dreams, and she told us about a nightmare she had about a week before. She damn near perfectly described the dream I had, only from the point of view of that woman and mine, even describing the man in detail, knowing there was someone else about a half block behind her, and being confused when the man said, "This one's mine," before ripping her head off. Midnight Monster here. If you have any dream-related stories you would like to share in the comment sections below, do it. I love to hear any scary stories that's associated with today's topic of unsolved mysteries. About 2 years ago, my sister was home alone while my mom was at work and I was at school. I finished earlier that day and I was home around 1 p.m. I was talking to my sister and she casually mentioned my mom came home for a while. Right away I thought it was odd because my mom works a few towns over, and even if she came home on our lunch break, she'd have to leave to go back to the time she got here, but I thought maybe she had an appointment or something. So I asked my sister if she said anything, and here's what my sister says happened. She was upstairs in her room when she heard the front door unlock, so she walked over to the stairs to see who it was. The stairs were facing the front door, so you could see it from the top of the stairs. Saw my mom taking her coat off and hanging it up. She looked over at my sister without saying anything, after which my sister was just like, "Oh, okay, it's just mom," and went back to her room. She also did not hear her leave. When she told me this, I was pretty spooked because my mom would not have not said a word. She'd say hi at the very least. I proceeded to call my mom and ask her if she's been home recently just to make sure, and just as I thought, She had not been home since she left that morning. We still don't know who or what my sister saw, but I was afraid of being home alone for the next 2 weeks. While visiting Rome a few years back, the group I was with decided to tour the Vatican. One of our friends had a friend who was a brother studying to be a priest. He was going to get us past the tourist barrier for a closer look at everything, while we participated in a small mass at one of the numerous altars. When we met up with this fellow, he immediately struck me as someone that I've met before. Almost someone that I had a good relationship with, but could not explain where or why I had known him. I did not mention anything as I was too busy hiding the pocket knife that I'd accidentally left in my bag before trying to get into the basilica. The tour was interesting and the mass was a unique experience, but the whole time, this feeling like I knew the man was haunting me. He invited us out to get a coffee at a shop afterward, and I took the time to retrieve the pocket knife and I hid it under a trash can. When I returned, there was a seat for me right in front of my brother. I sat down, apologized, and started to listen to the conversations. Yet as soon as this guy had the chance to talk to me directly, he says, "Have I met you before? I have this strange feeling that we know each other, but I can't place it." I was blown away. We both were. This was the first conversation we had, and we both believed that we've known each other personally. But when he explained his life over the back in America, I couldn't think of any reasonable explanation as to where we could have met. And even if we did, the feeling was that of a close friend, not of an "I shook hands with you once." Okay guys, Midnight Monster here. So I've had similar experiences where I can swear I've recognized someone. Has anybody else had those same feelings when you meet someone or see someone in a group of friends and you're like, I know this person? Let me know if you've ever had that type of experience before. When I was dating a guy in Chicago, we reached a point where I was considering how serious I wanted to get with him, as I was beginning to see little red flags pop up. Meantime, the lawyer I worked for moved out of state and got a temp job at a random law firm I've never heard of before. I walked in and they showed me where to go. I started working, and at some point I needed a pencil or paper clip or something, and I opened up the drawer to my desk to look for one. The entire desk was empty except for one item, a framed wedding photo of the guy I was dating and his ex-wife. It had been her desk. The city of Chicago is a huge place, and it has more than its share of lawyers. The odds of me and my boyfriend's ex sharing that desk are rather incalculable to me. I've never been a temp before, never met the woman, and never have been in that building. She wasn't a temp either. I asked her coworkers after finding the photo, and she'd worked there in a mid-level position for something like 10 years, before leaving directly after their divorce. It wasn't even a desk normally assigned to temps, which is why it still had the items of hers in it. I never got over the image of her leaving, just that one thing that she did not want on an otherwise empty desk. I thought, of course, that this was the biggest strange coincidence I've ever personally had. But I thought even more of what would be going through a woman's mind that would compel her into so deliberately leaving that one thing. And my thoughts illuminated the red flags. Correctly as turned out, and I ended our relationship. However, it came to be I was assigned to that woman's desk. I will always be grateful to her for the warning of her abandoned photo that she gave me. I hope she's had a happier life since. I've been following a case pretty closely, and there are a couple things I want to clear up. There was a podcast recently where the host interviewed the lead detective on the case. He emphasized that the dog searched the building pretty thoroughly, and the construction area was not in a state where he could have accidentally been buried. In addition to that, when the Ugly Tuna closed, the employees just used the emergency exit as a normal exit and the alarm was not working. It's possible the alarm wasn't working back in 2006, but we can't be sure. If it wasn't working, there's also the fact that the footage of the camera recording this exit had been taped over by the time police looked into his disappearance. Also, the police pored over the footage of that night and were able to follow everyone who entered the bar, to the point where they exited later that night, except for Brian Schaefer. Also, Detective Corbett said that they did get a possible scent trail going to a nearby Wendy's. where it's possible someone would not have been captured on camera in such a short distance. Now, I'm gonna throw my theory in there. I think he left the bar through the emergency exit with an employee. The employee may have already been in the building and not been counted entering, so they would not have missed leaving that night. Whatever happened after they left is anyone's guess. I could buy either the foul play theory or the theory that he ran away. I've always wondered if the cell phone ping was maybe him thinking about returning to his old life and turning it on for a weekend in Hilliard before deciding to disappear permanently. Or maybe some random person found that phone ditched somewhere in Hilliard. One thing is for certain, the disappearance of Brian Schaefer is definitely a mystery. I was working at a summer camp in Maine. I've done the drive back to New Hampshire more than a few times. It took about 3 hours as it was over 120 miles away. Technically a bit shorter, but it's New England. Roads twist and wind like crazy, so I call my parents a little after 9 and tell them I'll be leaving soon. Get my stuff and head to the car, pulling out perhaps 10 minutes later. Everything's going fine at first, but then I notice my GPS flicker and die. I have not taken the highway for fear of Friday night traffic, and I'm mostly passing through small towns with no directional signs. A minute or two later, I figured out the plug-in my car isn't working, and thus my GPS had not been charging. Oh well, I think. I'll just use my phone's GPS. I'm in the backwoods and my phone isn't getting a signal, so now utterly panicked, I just keep driving on this road winding through trees. It's paved, but there's nothing out there. A few turn off into the dark woods with no buildings, but no towns and not a soul in sight. I occasionally pass an old dilapidated house or a couple abandoned-looking gas stations that seem decades old. But the only time I see lights was when I passed this strange building sitting at the end of a long driveway. It had floor-to-ceiling glass windows, and I could see inside what looked like a country club or ballroom, perhaps a car showroom, with no furniture or anything I could make out inside. All the lights were on, though, illuminating the empty field surrounding it and rows of silent cars parked out front. Something about it terrified little 16-year-old me, and I kept driving. I was going about 70 or 80 miles per hour, as fast as I felt safe driving on that slowly winding road, almost hoping a cop car would pull me over so I could ask for help. Just as I was starting to actually freak out, I see lights up ahead on the road and turn onto the little dirt road that appear on the tree line. I turn onto that road, figuring I can probably find a gas station or something to stop at. Takes me a minute to recognize one of the buildings and realize I'm about 3-minute drive from home, just across the lake. I drive across the bridge, pull up to the driveway, and walk inside. As I do, my parents came downstairs looking confused. After a few confused comments, they say they thought I had left around 9. I said I did. At which point I look over at the clock and realize it's just past 10:30. My GPS had died around 10, 30 to 45 minutes into my drive. The Bodom Lake Murders. In 1960 Finland, a group of 4 teenagers were camping near Lake Bodom. 2 girls, both age 15, and 2 guys, both age 18. At night, 3 of them were killed, and the only one of the boys survived. Their bodies and horribly injured boy were found a few hours before noon. The badly injured boy was laying on top of the bloody tent. If you search for pictures of the tent, you can see that it's completely drenched in blood. The boy was not fully conscious and had several fractures in his skull. He survived and is still alive today with no memory of what happened. The police tried everything to find out what happened. Later in 2005, the survivor was accused of being the murderer. I, however, do not believe this to be true. Some of the teens' possessions were taken, wallets, shoes, etc., some being later found 500 meters away. With the injuries he had, walking that distance would have been impossible. Also, why come back to the crime scene? There was also no way this boy could have caused himself injuries to the back of the head. Also, sometimes like the leather jacket from the boy that died still had not been found. To search for the murderer, the largest manhunt in Finland's history was conducted. 88 searched criminals were found in the forest of Espoo as a result, but not the murderer. There were multiple sightings of a light-haired man walking nearby the crime scene before and after the crime. He was never found. Disappearance of the Sauter children. Christmas Eve 1945, the Sauter family in Fayetteville, West Virginia burned to the ground. There's the father, George, the mother, Jenny, and 9 children. 4 of the children escaped, but 5 were believed to have died in that fire. Then, during the search of the burned house, none of the children's remains were ever found. The fire was nowhere near hot enough to burn through bone, but not a trace of them were found. Here's the freaky shit. 2 months before, a visiting salesman told George his house would, quote, go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. The salesman attributed this to George's dirty remarks against Mussolini. George, an Italian immigrant, had been outspoken against Mussolini, which angered some of his Italian-American community. Another visitor later told George that his fuse boxes would cause a fire someday. This was after George just had his electricity rewired and expected to be safe. In the weeks before Christmas, the older Sauter children noticed a car following them through the main town as they walked home from school. During that night of the fire, Jenny was awoken by a strange phone call after the midnight, asking for a name she did not know. At 1 a.m., Jenny heard a loud banging on the house's roof, but went back to sleep when she did not hear anything further. Half an hour later, she smelled smoke. The fire seemed to start near the fuse box. George, Jenny, and 4 of the children who had been sleeping downstairs escaped the house. They yelled to the children upstairs, but heard no response. The fire had already been engulfing the staircase, so they could not rescue them. George tried to go outside around the house to use a ladder to climb to the window of the attic and rescue the children, but the ladder was not in its usual place. It would be found 75 feet away in an embankment. Then, George tried to drive both his truck to the window, then climb them, but neither truck would start, despite both having worked the previous day. Later, a telephone repairman told the Sauters that the house's phone line had not been burned through the fire, as they had initially thought, but cut by someone. The driver of a bus that passed through Fayetteville late Christmas Eve said he had seen some people throwing balls of fire at the house. Other witnesses claimed to have seen the children themselves. One woman who had been watching the fire from the road had been seen some of them peering out of a passing car while the house was burning. Years later, in the 60s, Jenny found in the mail a letter addressed to her, postmarked in Central City, Kentucky. No return address. Inside was a picture of a young man around 30 years old with features strongly resembling Louise's, who had been in his 30s. If he had survived, on the back was written, Louis Sauter I, love brother Frankie, little boys A90132 or 35. The Sauters never stopped believing their children were alive, and Jenny wore black in mourning every day for the rest of her life. A creepy one off the top of my head is the harassment of Bill and Dorothy Wacker, an elderly couple from Ohio. Their house had been ransacked a couple times between 1984 and 1985. Then in July of 1985, a stranger knocked on their door while Dorothy was home alone, recovering from heart surgery, asking to use their phone due to his car apparently breaking down. She thought he'd left after making the call, but then was knocked unconscious by a blow to the head. Dorothy woke up bound and gagged on the kitchen floor, but thankfully managed to crawl to an open window to get help from neighbors who called the police. Bill then returned home to find his revolver, among a few other things, had been stolen. This was accompanied by the message, "Cheaper, but will do," scrolled in crayon on one of their walls. 4 months later, the revolver turned up on their porch in a bag. The harasser repeatedly phoned the couple, sometimes threatened them and sometimes just breathing deeply down the phone line. Fucking creepy. Despite changing their phone number multiple times, they were unable to stop the calls. After this, they installed security lights. The harasser responded with a note saying, "Your lights are a laugh." They were frequently left other mocking and scary notes. Dorothy was then attacked once more in 1993, a full 8 fucking years after the original attack, this time being sent to the hospital with skull lacerations. The Wackers staked out their own house after this in an attempt to find the person who had been harassing them. However, they did not find anything. After the stakeout had been called off, they heard banging at the side of their house and found a note simply saying, Get the message. After this, as far as I can recall, the harassment abruptly stopped. It really freaks me out. What motive would one have to harass a random old couple for years and years? They never got close to finding out who did it, and both Bill and Dorothy died without ever finding out who made their lives a living hell. This is going to sound absolutely nuts. This is a personal mystery of mine that has always kind of perplexed me. When I was little, maybe 6 or so, my grandpa bought one of those cheap plastic snakes. You know the kind. It is coiled up and the bottom of the snake is like black and hollowed out. Anyways, he bought this snake and told me that if I was ever being bad and did something I was not supposed to do, this snake would come to life and bite me. I remember kind of rolling my eyes and going about my day, because of course toys can never come to life and hurt you for being bad. So, some time passes and one day I'm sitting in my sunroom playing when I decide to write my teacher a letter, but could not find a pen or crayon, so I decide to use my aunt's nail polish. This was a big no-no, but I was pretty much left to my own devices, so I did not care. I remember about halfway through writing the letter, I look up and notice that plastic snake coiled up a foot in front of me. This was weird because I have not seen that snake in forever, and definitely had not been playing with it. I picked it up and threw it further away from me, remembering my grandpa's warning that it would come to life and bite me if I was being bad. You know, like I was currently doing. I remember taking note of where it landed because that thing creeped me out. I go back to my letter and promptly forget about it. A few minutes later, I hear an odd noise that I couldn't place and saw some movement out of the corner of my eye. Where I'd thrown this cheap plastic snake was now a very real and alive snake. I flipped my shit. I climbed a bookcase in my room screaming for someone to come help me. My mom rushed into the room just in time to see this snake slither out of sight. She got my grandpa and my uncles and they hunted for this snake for what seemed like hours while I stayed perched on the bookcase. They finally found it, take it outside and promptly kill it. The weird part, besides that it was the exact spot I threw the plastic snake, was that after that day I never saw that plastic snake again. It just straight up vanished. I'm sure there may be a reasonable explanation, hell. I was young and kids are a kind of known for their vivid imaginations, but it has always kind of unsettled me. How much of a coincidence is it that this snake just happened to get out of our house that day? Just happened to be in the same spot I threw that snake, and out of all the rooms in the house managed to coil up right in front of where I was being bad. I moved to a new area and needed a haircut. Went on Google, found a barber, easy peasy. It was in a L-shaped strip mall. Barber was an old man, and during conversation I mentioned that I was a veteran. He said he was a veteran too. At first I was enjoying the conversation because veterans can have a lot to talk about across generations, but this conversation quickly developed into racist nonsense, which we were both white and his stories were anti-black. I did not call him out on this, just resolved that I would never go back to this barbershop again. Haircut ends and I go to pay with my debit card. He doesn't take cards, but says I can go to the bank at the other end of the strip mall, so I do. For whatever reason, I don't bother going inside the bank, and I don't want to get into my car because I don't want the barber to think I'm driving off without paying. So I just walk through the bank's drive-through ATM and get the cash. I started walking back to the barber, but I hear a voice behind me. It's a teenager, waving my ATM card. Apparently, I left it in the machine and I thank him, take the card back, pay the barber, and leave. Sometime later, I need another haircut, so I Google to find a new barber again. But despite the fact that the racist guy used to be the first result, there's no longer a listing for him. I figured he retired or even maybe died. Or maybe his racism did put him out of business. I don't give it another thought at the time. It's not a mystery. At least, not an interesting one. Small business in a strip mall comes and goes. But shortly thereafter, I drive by where the strip mall was, and it's gone. The entire mall. It's all gone. Just an overgrown field. No hint that anything else used to be here at all. No hint that land is for sale or any other indication of what might have happened. This has been a full strip mall just 2 to 3 months earlier, and the barber never mentioned in our chat that he expected this to happen. The attached bank had been part of the major chain. They don't usually just disappear. Could the strip mall have gone out of business? Sure. But then who would pay to tear down the building? If the building did have to come down, then why did someone also take the trouble turning the paved parking lot into an overgrown grass field? The most obvious answer, of course, is that I'm simply wrong about where the strip mall was located. I admit, this almost has to be the answer. However, a few points to consider. Number 1, the strip mall had a strange layout unlike any I've seen before. This was due to the strange parcel of land strip mall that was built on. Parcel that perfectly matched this now grass lot. Number 2, the whole thing became a bit of a, earworm. If that's the right phrase here. But the more I thought about this, the more that didn't add up. So I became very interested in solving this. And the most obvious way to solve it would be to simply find where the strip mall actually was. But I explored this area by car and Google Maps repeatedly. Although I knew I hadn't driven far when I found it the first time, I expanded my search. Once after I posted about this online, someone seized on this racist part and found a Yelp review accusing a barber of racism in my area. And yes, the barber was next to a bank on Google Maps. This was more than an hour away from my home, but the rest seemingly all fit. Aha! Case closed. But when I dropped into Street View, it wasn't a strip mall at all. The barber was in an entirely separate building from the bank. Absolutely nothing matched at all. Number 3. This could easily just be my brain playing tricks now that I consider it all to be a mystery. But suddenly the whole thing has an old-timey feel to it when I look back. Someone being blatantly racist in a place of business. An inability to pay by ATM card, even though the teen who found my card gave it to me suddenly feels like Richie Cunningham. Happy days, in my memory. Do I believe actually somehow I time traveled to an area where the strip mall existed? Of course not, I'm a rational person. Not prone to believing things like that. But I've spent years trying to find a rational explanation and have never managed to do so. Okay, that's all the stories I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed today's Unsolved Mysteries stories, and just know Midnight Monster drops daily videos of the most hair-raising content you can think of, anything from mysteries to alien abductions to downright unsolved murder mysteries. So subscribe to the channel if that's something you like, and I'll see everyone in tomorrow's video.